I welcome you to this, the third installment of our study through the Old Testament book of Exodus. It's so good to be with you again. This is a really important one because we're going to watch Moses facing some significant discouragement. And discouragement has been the language of every one of our hearts at some point in our lives. So let's track with this. First of all, afterward, we're told in Exodus 5, verse 1, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go." That's the mission that God has sent Moses on, to get Israel out of their brutal slavery in Egypt into freedom and towards the promised land, or the land that God had promised Abraham generations earlier. Let my people go, so I may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Now, it says the word afterward is pretty packed full. Where have we been? Well, Moses is 80 years old now, 40 years learning from the best educational systems in the world in Egypt, another 40 years shepherding sheep in the desert of Midian. And then God meets him in the burning bush, helps overcome his insecurities, is helpful to him. He meets with the elders of Israel. They have favor. And here, even with the supernatural, like throwing his rod down on the ground and it turning into a snake, and picking him up by the tail and it turns into his rod again, even these supernatural confirmations behind him, Aaron to kind of be his mouthpiece because Moses is insecure about his speaking ability. I mean, it's all there. That afterward should make Moses pretty confident by this point, except the one thing, given all of that behind him, the one thing that he didn't think would happen, happens. He goes and asks Pharaoh to let them go, and Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Notice he says, "I don't know the Lord." The Egyptians had all kinds of gods they served, but this Lord, he said, "I have no idea who you're talking about. And if you think I'm going to listen to that God, I've got plenty of gods of my own. I will not let Israel go." And then things go from bad to worse. That same day, Pharaoh gave this order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. This is the people of Israel. "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw." Now, up to this point, as they made bricks for Pharaoh's cities, there was a supply chain, and the straw that would go into the making of the bricks and kind of help those bricks stay together, they were no longer going to be supplied straw. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. And that word quota becomes their nemesis. How are they going to keep up the quota of bricks every day when their supply chain of straw is gone? And the answer is they can't. So as we continue to read, the supervisors of Hebrew supervisors of the work teams, they're paying a huge price. They're being beaten because they can't meet the quota. And there's no understanding. In fact, these supervisors of work teams, they go into Pharaoh and they plead for mercy and try to get a different ruling. And Pharaoh just calls them lazy and kicks them out. So the Israelites, in verse 19, the Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble. That has to be the understatement of the book of Exodus. We are in a heap of trouble. And of course, where do you go then? Well, you go to your leaders and get angry with them. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them. And they said, "May the Lord look on you and judge you." These are not sympathetic words. "For you have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials, and have put a sword in their hand to kill us." So they're projecting all of the blame, of course, and rightfully so in this case, on Moses. It was Moses who showed up and gave them this whole thing that God's coming to deliver you, and I'm going to go to Pharaoh, and look at the burning bush and the supernatural confirmations I have, and Pharaoh's going to let us go. And he said no. And so I wonder if you've ever had a prayer meeting like this. Moses goes to the Lord and said, why? I mean, I prayed that 1,000 times. Why? Why, Lord? Have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? I mean, ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. It goes from why to you. If you read some of the Psalms, they often begin this way in our Old Testament. They're called Psalms of Lament, which involve grief, expressing emotional pain, and often protest. It's like, Lord, why don't you hear my prayers anymore? Like, where are you? And how come it looks like you're not doing anything? Have you forgotten me forever? And some of the Psalms begin that way, and I'm thankful that it's safe. It needs to be reverently, because he's the God and creator and we're not, but there are times where God can handle our honesty and say, Lord, I don't understand what's going on. Why are you letting this happen? And God, to be honest, I've done my part and you're not doing your part. What Moses was really dealing with is what I call a discouragement gap. And it's common to all of our lives. In fact, one of the great skills in life that all of us need to master if we're going to cope with life is managing that gap between what we expect and what we experience. What we expect, that's often the ideal. What we experience is, on the other hand, the real. And in so many areas of life, those two things do not match up. There's always a gap. And if you have ever traveled in London and got on the subways, sometimes when the subway doors open, you'll hear this recorded voice that says, "Mind the gap," in a British accent. That's the gap between the station platform and the floor of the subway. There's a gap. Don't trip over it. Mind the gap. And we need to learn how to mind the gap. And, we can fill the gap with all kinds of things. In fact, I thought of a lot of words like discouragement that also start with D. Words like disappointment and disillusionment and disorientation and even despair and depression. But where God's going to take Moses next is how that he can fill that gap between what he expected God to do and what it looked like God was doing, which was nothing. He ends up filling this gap for Moses with faith. And that's the way we walk, in the tension. Always hoping for more, even expecting God to come through, but it doesn't always seem to happen the way we think. And yet we fill this gap, not with despair, not with discouragement, not with depression, but with faith. So before we look at how God does that with Moses, maybe good just to reflect on when we've experienced serious disappointment or discouragement in our lives. This is a very, very important issue in life. Overcoming discouragement, minding the gap. And when have you had to face this in your life? Well, here's how God's going to respond. And I'm amazed what God doesn't do here. God is not going to do the empathetic thing with Moses. Like, Moses, I know this is hard. I know you didn't expect Pharaoh to say no. I know everybody's angry at you now. This must be really tough, Moses. I feel bad for you. I mean, I wish God would be a little sympathetic with me sometimes. Neither does God do the explain myself thing to him. He's not going to explain himself to Moses. It seems like following the Lord, there are some days where the Lord seems to have no felt need to explain himself to me, even when I'd like him to. Instead, he says, then the Lord said to Moses, Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh. Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. In other words, instead of being empathetic or trying to explain himself to Moses, he just refocuses Moses on the mission and in essence says, even though it looks like I'm not doing anything, I'm always doing something. And it reminds me that our challenges do not necessarily change God's purposes. That's such a foundational thing in our lives, that our challenges don't change the purposes of God in our lives. They may look like they're threatening them. We may not understand what God's doing, but he's always doing something. That's what faith brings us to. God, I'm confident, I'll get it, but you're always doing something. And that my challenges right now do not change your purposes. And God also said to Moses, and he does a second thing. He's going to reintroduce himself to Moses. God also said to Moses, I am the Lord. Remember that I am that I am in chapter 3 that spoke of God's sufficiency? All that you will need me to be, I will be to you. I am the Lord. And I appeared to Abraham and to Isaac and to Jacob as God Almighty. And you can read about this back in the book of Genesis. And God Almighty, sometimes we know that term with the familiar El Shaddai. El Shaddai means God Almighty, his name. But by my name, the Lord. And Lord, this would be the I am name. This would be Yahweh, Jehovah, or often translated Lord. By the name the Lord, I did not make myself fully known to them. And this is the very first time in the Bible where God clearly identifies himself as Yahweh. I am the Lord. See, our discouragements always create opportunities for God to reintroduce himself to us. When you're going through a time, you just don't understand. God's setting the stage to reveal himself in a new way. In the past, I revealed myself this way. But now in this holistic way, Moses, you're going to see that I will be all you need me to be. And that's why next, I call them the 7 I wills of the great I am. The 7 I wills. What God does now is promise 7 ways in which God will be what we need him to be. Therefore, say to the Israelites, he says to Moses, and we can count them, I am the Lord. There it is, the starting point. And first of all, I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians. I'm going to free you. And I will free you from being slaves to them. And I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. And I will take you as my own people. And I will be your God. And I will bring you to the land I swore with uplifted hand to give to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. And I will give it to you as a possession. And then the bottom line, I am the Lord. I'm the sufficient one. 7 I wills, because God is reintroducing himself. What does he do? He refocuses Moses on the mission. Just stay focused on the mission, because even though it looks like I'm not doing anything, I'm doing a lot right now. I'm always doing something, but I'm also always looking at new ways to reintroduce myself to you. If we pull all those together, there they are. I will bring you out, I will free you from, I will redeem you, I will take you, I will be your God, I will bring you to, I will give it to you, for I am the Lord. If I could write one name over all of this, it's the name Jesus. Jesus, who himself said, before Abraham was, I am. He is the one who will bring us out from the kingdom of darkness by what he did on the cross when he died for us. He's the one who frees us from sin and from the power of evil. He redeemed us when he shed his blood. He becomes our God, not just anybody's God, but our God personally. And he will bring us to the inheritance he has for us in heaven. And he will give it to us, the future that he has destined us to. All of this is fulfilled in Jesus. So as we end today, what truths could you be telling yourself when you get discouraged? When you are navigating the gap between what you expect and what you're experiencing short term, just like Moses, what truth could you be telling yourself? Your discouragement has a lot of lies behind it, but what truths could you be telling yourself? And what priorities might God be wanting you to refocus on in those moments? He just refocuses Moses on the mission and reintroduces himself to Moses. And maybe there's things we just need to refocus on, as well as truth we need to tell ourselves. So why don't you discuss that in your groups, and may God bless you.